Before empires, before stories, before the very sound of language, the world was silent. Not the silence of absence, but of potential. A world breathing quietly, waiting to be named. Across the endless plains between the Tigris and Euphrates, early humans moved like shadows against the dawn. They had no words, yet everything they did spoke. A hand raised in warning, a cry in hunger, a song without meaning hummed beside a fire. Each gesture carried memory, but memory was fragile. The stories they shared through motion and tone faded as generations passed. Nothing endured beyond the living voice. The world turned, the rivers shifted, and even the greatest hunts, the fiercest storms, dissolved into forgetting. Still, a need stirred within them, a hunger to preserve what vanished too quickly. It began as instinct. A hunter drew a line in the sand to count his kills. A mother arranged stones in patterns near the hearth to remember her children. The tribe carved marks on cave walls to honor their dead. No one called it language, but something ancient moved behind those gestures. The first spark of permanence. Seasons turned into centuries. The people of the fertile lands settled near the great rivers. They learned to tame floods, to plant grain, to trade beyond sight. But as trade grew, memory faltered. Promises were forgotten, debts disputed, names lost to time. The voice, once trusted, proved unsteady. One evening, after a storm, a young man watched his father trace lines in the wet earth, one for every jar of grain owed. When morning came, the marks remained, hardened by sun. The boy touched them and realized something powerful. The earth had remembered. No one could have known that moment marked the beginning of history. From those simple scratches would rise cities, temples, and empires built upon the written word. But in that quiet beginning, there was no glory, no grand revelation, only dust, light, and the soft hum of realization that thought could leave a trace. Humanity had found a way to speak to time itself. The silence of the world was ending, and the age of memory was about to begin. The rivers of Mesopotamia carved through the earth like veins, carrying life to the cities that would one day define civilization. Along their muddy banks, the settlements of Sumeria were rising, small clusters of clay brick homes, fields heavy with barley, herds moving through the plains. The world was changing. Men no longer wandered. They stayed, built, harvested, traded, and with permanence came complexity, the kind of complexity that could no longer survive on memory alone. At first, memory had been enough. A man remembered how many sheep his neighbor had borrowed or how much grain was owed to the temple. But memory faltered. Words changed in retelling, and fairness became fragile. The elders would argue over what had been promised, voices rising under the desert sun. Truth began to feel uncertain. To preserve truth, they turned to the earth. They shaped small balls of clay, each one a token of meaning, a cone for a measure of grain, a sphere for a jar of oil, a disk for a herd of goats. These were not words, but they were symbols, thought made physical. The tokens were stored in baskets, counted and exchanged like coins. Each represented a promise that could now be seen and touched. But the baskets grew heavy. Trade spread beyond the village walls. The temple, once the center of worship, became the center of record. Scribes and priests struggled to keep up with the flow of goods moving through the city gates. Then someone, no one knows who, pressed a token into a soft tablet of clay, leaving an impression behind. The token was set aside, but its image remained. For the first time, an object could be remembered by its mark. That moment changed everything. The impression became a habit, the habit became a system, and the system became writing. Each mark pressed into clay was a trace of thought, captured in silence. No longer did they need the token itself. The sign was enough. In the city of Uruk, the air hummed with the rhythm of invention. Scribes sat cross-legged in the temple courtyards, clay tablets drying in the sun beside them. They held sharpened reeds, dipped their tips into soft earth, and carved patterns with practiced hands. Each stroke carried intention. Each wedge was a thought. The wet clay cooled in the evening air, turning their words, or what would become words, into something eternal. The marks were simple at first, lines for quantities, circles for goods, strokes for names. But as the cities grew, so did the language. The scribes found ways to connect their symbols, to combine sound and meaning, to shape not just records, but sentences. Writing, once born from trade, began to awaken the soul. A scribe might press his reed into clay and realize that what he had written was not just an account of barley, but a fragment of the world itself, a pattern that reflected how humans saw and shaped reality. These were no longer just marks. They were thoughts turned into matter. At night, the scribes often worked by lamplight, surrounded by shelves of drying tablets. The smell of baked clay filled the room. The flicker of flame threw shadows across their faces. They spoke little. To write was to commune with something sacred. They were preserving the will of kings, the wealth of temples, the voices of gods. And though they did not yet call themselves creators, they had become exactly that. Outside the temple walls, life continued. Farmers planting by the river, merchants leading donkeys through narrow streets, children chasing one another through dust. They had no idea that in those quiet rooms, the world was being rewritten forever. Every few generations, the system evolved. Pictographs, small drawings that resembled objects, began to replace the tokens. A jar became a curved outline. A star became a cross. But pictures alone could not hold every idea, so the symbols grew abstract. A word could now represent not just a thing, but an action, a thought, a sound. The clay tablets of Uruk soon bore the first signs of language transformed. The priests called it divine. The merchants called it useful. The rulers called it power. With writing came control over memory, over trade, over truth itself. Laws could now be fixed, debts tracked, prayers recorded. The spoken word, once fleeting, could now be bound forever. Those who could read and write were few, but their influence reached across every life. In a single stroke, humanity had divided itself, the literate and the forgotten. Still, there was wonder in it, a quiet awe that every mark held meaning. A single wedge could alter a contract. A symbol could seal a destiny. Writing, once the servant of memory, had become its master. One evening, as the sun sank behind Uruk's ziggurat, a young scribe wiped his hands clean of clay. His tablet was filled with symbols he barely understood, copied from an older master's hand. He stared at them, tracing the grooves with his fingers. In that moment, he realized something strange. Though he did not speak the words aloud, he could feel them. The meaning pulsed in his mind like a voice that did not need air. It was as if the clay itself remembered. Outside, the sound of river water echoed faintly through the streets. He placed the tablet beside the others, unaware that in doing so he had contributed to humanity's greatest inheritance. the ability to think beyond time. The first libraries began in these very temples. Thousands of tablets lined the shelves, carrying the weight of generations. The scribes believed that their records would please the gods, but perhaps what they truly worshipped was continuity, the idea that knowledge could survive death. And survive it did. When the cities fell, the fires raged, and the temples turned to dust, the clay tablets endured. Buried beneath centuries of earth, they waited, unbroken, unread, unforgotten. Millennia later, when modern archaeologists uncovered them, the marks still told their stories. The same symbols that once bound barley and silver now whispered to another age about the dawn of civilization. The first marks in the dust had become the world's memory, and through them humanity learned its most powerful truth, that ideas could outlive the body, that thought could be immortal. Every word written since, every book, every code, every glowing screen is a descendant of those first impressions pressed into clay beneath the Mesopotamian sun. And though the scribes of Uruk are long gone, their echoes remain, hidden in every sentence we write, every name we remember, every story that refuses to die. In the great cities that rose from the Mesopotamian plain, writing no longer belonged to the marketplace alone. It had ascended the temple steps. Inside the sacred halls of Uruk and Eridu, among burning incense and polished altars, the stylus became more than a tool. It became a symbol of divine connection. Those who could command the marks on clay now stood between men and gods. The scribes were chosen young. Their training was long and merciless. They learned not only the shapes of symbols, but their hidden weight, how each mark carried a fragment of creation. In the Aduba, the tablet house schools, rows of students sat cross-legged on reed mats, copying lines from their masters until their hands cramped. They practiced until the wedges were perfect, until the clay itself seemed to breathe under their touch. In the silence of those rooms, a strange reverence grew. The stylus in their hands was not merely an instrument, it was destiny. Among the Sumerians, it was said that the god Nabu watched over them. Nabu, son of Marduk, keeper of the tablets of fate. On the first day of each year, the priests believed he rewrote the destinies of kings and peasants alike. The scribes in their devotion mimicked the gods, recording offerings, births, and laws. They were the hands of eternity, pressing human life into clay. Far to the west, along the shining Nile, another form of writing awakened. Here, the Egyptians carved symbols not into clay, but into the very bones of stone. Their hieroglyphs shimmered with meaning, part art, part invocation. To them, writing was Medu Neter, the words of the gods. Each image was alive, pulsing with the magic of Heka, the sacred force that held the universe together. The god Thoth, ibis-headed, wise, and eternal, was said to have created the first words. He measured the heavens, named the stars, and recorded the deeds of the dead. Every scribe who dipped his brush into ink whispered a silent prayer to him. They believed that to write was to participate in creation, to echo the speech that once called the world into being. In the candle-lit halls of Karnak and Thebes, scribes bent over papyrus scrolls, their hands moving with measured grace. The air smelled of soot and lotus oil. Outside, the desert stretched to infinity. Inside, the temple walls glowed with carved prayers meant to last beyond death. When a pharaoh's tomb was sealed, the walls around his sarcophagus were covered in hieroglyphs, spells to guide his soul through the underworld. Every word was a key, every symbol a breath. They believed a name written was a life preserved. To erase a name was the cruelest curse. When a ruler fell from favor, his name was hacked from the monuments, not only destroyed in stone, but condemned to vanish from memory. Writing had become the boundary between existence and oblivion. The scribes who served these beliefs knew their power, but they also carried its weight. A single mistake, a line misplaced, a sign inverted, could offend the gods or distort a ritual, and yet, despite the danger, they continued. Each stroke of ink or cut of chisel was an act of faith. Across lands and centuries, the same idea echoed. Writing was a bridge between the mortal and the divine. In the East, the oracle priests of China heated bones until they cracked, reading the fissures as messages from ancestors and spirits. They carved their questions. Will the rains come? Will the king's army prevail? Into the bone before it was burned. The answers, revealed in patterns of fracture, were then inscribed beside the questions. The dialogue between man and the unseen world became eternal. Every civilization, it seemed, had felt the same tremor. That language was not merely invented, but revealed. The marks humans made were mirrors of something higher, glimpses of cosmic order. Yet even as writing ascended toward heaven, it remained chained to human need. Kings demanded that their victories be recorded. Priests decreed laws in sacred text. The divine and the political became inseparable. The scribe's stylus could now bless or condemn, crown or erase. In Sumer, an ancient tablet told of a man who claimed to have written under Nabu's guidance. He recorded a flood sent by the gods to cleanse the earth, a story that would echo in myths for thousands of years. Whether he wrote from revelation or imagination, no one could tell. What mattered was that his words endured. His marks survived long after his bones had turned to dust. The line between myth and memory blurred, and in that blurring, writing became immortal. Somewhere, under the quiet light of an oil lamp, a young apprentice looked up from his tablet. His teacher slept nearby, the temple silent except for the distant sound of water dripping from the roof. The boy stared at his work, the neat rows of symbols, and wondered whether Nabu himself was watching. He couldn't know that, thousands of years later, his marks would still be read, his language still spoken by scholars who had never seen his world. In that fragile moment, beneath the flicker of a dying flame, a truth settled across time. Writing was not only born from the gods, it had made gods of those who used it. By the time the great city of Uruk reached its height, the clay tablets no longer held only numbers or temple inventories. Something new had crept into the lines, something that breathed. The scribes had learned that words could not only record what existed, but conjure what did not. A harvest could be tallied, but a hero could also be born. From this awakening came stories. The earliest among them spoke of kings who defied death, gods who shaped destiny, and floods that swallowed the world. These tales began as hymns whispered before statues of stone, but over time they were pressed into clay, preserved for eyes that had not yet opened. In their grooves, the first emotions of humankind lived again: grief, longing, awe. In one dark chamber of Uruk, a set of tablets told of Gilgamesh, a king too proud to die. His story began as a chant, repeated in temple rituals. Yet when it was written, something miraculous happened. His voice crossed centuries. The clay once used to count barley now carried sorrow. It spoke of friendship and loss, of the desperate reach for immortality. The first story ever written was, fittingly, about the fear of being forgotten. Every mark the scribe made was deliberate, carved into wet earth with reverent hands. When the tablets hardened, they became eternal, fragile to the touch, but unyielding to time. Fire could crack them, water could bury them, but the words endured. The world's first literature had been born, not from ink or parchment, but from dust and persistence. In these stories, gods wept and mortals dreamed. The people who read them felt something they could not explain: recognition. They saw themselves mirrored in the clay, their own struggles reflected in the epic of a distant king. Writing had transcended its purpose. It no longer served trade or prayer. It had become the echo of humanity's inner life. The scribes of Uruk, who once served temples and kings, had accidentally created eternity. Through them, thought learned to outlive breath, and emotion found its voice in stone. The clay tablets had awakened, and with them the human soul began to write its first memory. South of the deserts and shifting sands, where the Nile carved its green lifeline through gold and dust, a new civilization was taking shape, one that believed death was only the beginning. To the Egyptians, the river was eternity itself. It flooded, it withdrew, and it returned again. Everything that lived was expected to do the same. It was only natural, then, that their writing would follow the same rhythm: living, dying, and being reborn through stone. In the quiet before dawn, the banks of the Nile shimmered like metal beneath the stars. Priests walked barefoot along the temple corridors of Thebes, their torches painting hieroglyphic shadows across the walls. Every inch of stone was alive with meaning: falcons and ankhs, suns and spirals, each carved with precision that defied time. To read these signs was to touch divinity. They called them Medu Neter, the words of the gods. Unlike the sharp wedges of Sumer, Egypt's script was a dance. The symbols flowed, curved, and intertwined like the river itself. The Egyptians believed that language had power, not because it described the world, but because it commanded it. The god Thoth, with the head of an ibis and the quill of eternity, was said to have written the laws that govern the heavens. Every word the scribes carved was a fragment of his wisdom. A scribe's tools were simple: a reed pen, a palette of red and black ink, and a roll of papyrus. The reeds of the Nile transformed into pages of immortality. Yet their purpose was sacred. A single stroke out of place could corrupt a prayer. A single forgotten mark could silence a soul forever. They wrote to keep the world in balance. Each morning, the priests of Amun recorded offerings to the gods: jars of oil, baskets of grain, bolts of linen. To write them was to ensure they reached the divine realm. In their belief, what was written was real. A loaf of bread inscribed upon a tomb wall was no symbol. It was sustenance for the afterlife, and so death became a place of words. Inside the tombs of kings, the walls glowed with language. Long corridors were carved with hymns, invocations, and maps of the underworld. Every passage, every chamber, every sarcophagus was wrapped in the protection of the written word. The book of the dead, a collection of spells meant to guide the soul through darkness, was copied and buried with the departed. Those who could afford more asked for their names to be written hundreds of times. To be remembered was to live again. There was power in that name, Ren. The Egyptians believed a man died twice, once when his heart stopped beating, and again when his name was spoken for the last time. Writing, therefore, was not art. It was resurrection. But language, even sacred, is never safe from power. The scribes who served in the temples were servants of the gods, but also of kings. Pharaohs ruled not just with armies, but with ink. Decrees carved deep into stone could bind generations. To defy the written word was to defy divine order. When a ruler fell from grace, his name was erased from the monuments, not merely chiseled away, but ritually destroyed. The act was called damnatio memoriae, the condemnation of memory. In doing so, the Egyptians believed they could undo a man's existence. Stone that once promised immortality now became a weapon of oblivion. Yet still, they wrote, the scribes believed themselves chosen, mediators between man and God, life and death, chaos and order. Their training began as children. They learned to grind ink, to mix pigments, to steady their hands. Long before sunrise, they gathered in schools beside the temples, copying lines from ancient scrolls. Their masters watched closely, striking out mistakes with swift correction. A careless hand, they would say, is a curse upon the soul. Despite the discipline, there was beauty in their work, a quiet devotion that transcended fear. The hieroglyphs, with their shapes of birds, eyes, and suns, carried both sound and image. Each symbol was a tiny painting, a prayer frozen in motion. When placed together, they sang. It was said that when Thoth created writing, the sun god Ra warned him, "You have made a gift that will wound men. They will trust in signs and forget the truths within." Yet even Ra could not stop what had begun. Writing had escaped the divine realm. It now belonged to the world. In time, Egypt's language evolved, simplifying into hieratic and later Demotic script. Faster, more practical, used for contracts, letters, and trade. But in the tombs and temples, the sacred lines remained unchanged, untouched by haste. The divine words were too perfect to be rewritten. One evening, as the desert winds swept across the Valley of the Kings, a young apprentice stood alone in a half-finished tomb. The lamps flickered against the limestone. Before him stretched an empty wall, smooth as still water. He lifted his chisel and began to carve the first symbol, a falcon in flight. The stone groaned softly beneath his hand. With each stroke, the wall filled with life, serpents, stars, and sacred names. The boy worked until dawn, his arms trembling, his breath steady. He did not know that his carvings would survive thousands of years, that strangers, speaking a tongue unborn, would one day light torches in that same chamber and whisper awe at his work. He carved because he believed, because every line, every curve was a promise that death could be conquered through remembrance. And so the tombs of Egypt became libraries of eternity. Even now, when the desert night falls and the wind slides across the sand, it seems to carry a faint whisper. The murmur of chisels, the rhythm of breath, the soft scratch of a reed pen gliding over papyrus. The voices of the scribes have faded, but their words have not. They remain, immortal as the stone that bears them, singing the same truth the first mark in the dust once spoke. That writing is the human soul made visible. Not every voice that learned to write was destined to be heard. Across the world, far from the twin rivers of Mesopotamia and the golden temples of Egypt, other civilizations were carving, inscribing, and scratching their stories into stone. Some left behind entire languages, others only fragments. And while their cities crumbled and their names faded, their marks remained, mysterious, unbroken, unread. In the dry plains that stretch between modern Pakistan and northwest India, the Indus Valley civilization once thrived. Long before Greece dreamed of democracy or Rome raised its first wall, the people of Harappa and Mohenjo-Daro built cities of breathtaking order. Their streets were straight, their drains covered, their wells lined with precision. But of all their achievements, none has inspired more wonder than the tiny seals they left behind, carved pieces of steatite bearing animals, symbols, and signs unlike any other script known to man. Each seal is only the size of a coin, yet within its lines lies the memory of a civilization. There are images of bulls, elephants, tigers, and a figure seated cross-legged, perhaps a god, perhaps a king. Beneath them, strange markings flow, neither purely pictorial nor phonetic. Archaeologists have uncovered thousands of them, but no one can read what they say. Some believe the Indus people wrote prayers. Others think the seals marked ownership, trade, or ritual. Yet there is a deeper possibility that they spoke to us in a language that had no descendants, a language swallowed whole by time. When the Indus cities vanished, their wells dried, their people gone, their script went with them. No Rosetta Stone has ever been found, no bilingual text to unlock its meaning. The seals, once touched by human hands, now sit silent behind glass, their words turned to whispers of speculation. They are the ghosts of meaning, fragments of a message meant for no one now living. Far across the sea, another mystery slumbers in the ruins of Crete. Around 1900 BCE, the island's people, the Minoans, covered clay tablets with flowing symbols historians now call linear A. It was elegant, rhythmic, as if written to music. The Minoans traded with Egypt, Mesopotamia, and Anatolia, but their own language remains locked. Their script hints at complexity, perhaps laws, poems, or hymns, but no one can be certain. When the Minoans fell, their palaces burned, and their words died with them. Later, the Greeks borrowed and reshaped their system into Linear B, which scholars eventually deciphered. But Linear A, the language of the first European civilization, still refuses to speak. The lines remain intact, the clay preserved, yet the meaning is gone. It is as though the earth remembers the form of their thoughts, but not the sound. To the east, in the valleys of the Yellow River, another people carved questions into bone. The oracle bones of ancient China are among the earliest known attempts to speak to the unseen. Each bears a question. Will the harvest be good? Will the army return victorious? Shall the king's child live? Followed by cracks formed by fire, interpreted as answers from ancestors and spirits. Unlike the Indus or the Minoans, the Chinese script survived. It grew, evolved, and became the written language of a culture that still breathes today. But even there, silence lingered between the lines. The earliest forms of Chinese writing were as much ritual as record, sacred acts meant to preserve cosmic balance. Every question carved into bone was both an inquiry and a prayer. The characters were drawn from the natural world, the sun, the river, the mountain, as if to remind the living that their language was born from the same earth they questioned. Across oceans in the jungles of Central America, another civilization rose. The Maya. Their glyphs covered temple walls, stelae, and codices painted on bark paper. For centuries, no one could read them. Spanish conquerors, fearing their power, burned thousands of Maya books in pyres that turned night into smoke. The language of an entire world turned to ash. Only a handful of codices survived, the Dresden, the Madrid, the Paris, and from those charred remnants, scholars centuries later began to piece together the voice of the Maya. Their glyphs, once thought decorative, revealed themselves to be phonetic, complex, poetic, alive. The Maya had recorded not only the movements of planets and kings, but dreams, myths, and songs. Their writing system, like their architecture, was a map of eternity. Yet so much was lost that even now whole passages remain undeciphered. The fire that consumed their libraries was not just destruction, it was amnesia. The story of writing is filled with such silence. Languages born, spoken, and forgotten. The Olmecs, the Etruscans, the Rongorongo script of Easter Island, all whisper from the dark, their meanings hidden beneath the centuries. Each script is a lock without a key, a story without a voice. But perhaps this is the nature of writing itself. To endure beyond understanding, even unread it testifies, even lost it remains. A fragment of pottery, a carved stone, a scratched bone. They are more than relics. They are proof that someone once cared enough to remember, that someone, somewhere, feared oblivion just as we do. Imagine one of them now, a craftsman in Harappa, sitting beneath a fading sun. He holds a small piece of clay in his palm. Around him, the sounds of a city hum, traders shouting, children playing, a river murmuring nearby. He carves a symbol, perhaps for his name, perhaps for his God, perhaps for nothing more than habit. He doesn't know that millennia later, strangers will find it buried beneath rubble, hold it under artificial light, and wonder what he meant. He only knows that he must make the mark, because to leave no mark is to be forgotten. All across the ancient world, this same instinct beat within human hearts, the need to inscribe existence, to prove presence, to outlast breath. The lost scripts remind us that even silence can endure. Though their meanings have vanished, their shapes remain. A universal confession carved in 1,000 languages. We were here, we lived, we remembered. From the sacred silence of temples and tombs, writing descended to the open air. What had once belonged to priests and kings began to move through the hands of merchants and sailors. It was in this exchange, the trade of not gold but of words, that humanity's greatest simplification was born. Around 1800 BCE, along the jagged coasts of the eastern Mediterranean, the Phoenicians sailed from port to port, their ships heavy with cedar, copper, and purple dye. They traded not only goods, but symbols. Each culture they met, Egyptian, Canaanite, Mesopotamian, left its mark on their language. From these fragments, the Phoenicians created something no one had dared before, a system built not on images, but on sounds. The alphabet was the first true act of linguistic democracy. No longer did one need to memorize hundreds of symbols to write or read. 22 letters, simple, repeatable, adaptable, could capture every spoken word. It was a revolution disguised as efficiency. The world had learned to compress meaning. For the first time, writing could belong to anyone. Farmers could sign their names. Merchants could record debts without priests. The divine monopoly over the written word began to crumble. From Phoenicia, the idea spread like light across the sea. The Greeks took it, added vowels, and found music within it. They turned symbols into philosophy, myths into literature. From their letters came poetry and politics, mathematics and tragedy. The Romans reshaped it once more, etching Latin into marble, carrying it on their legions' banners. The alphabet gave humanity a mirror for its own voice. It was no longer bound to the god. It belonged to the street, the marketplace, the heart. With every letter carved, every scroll written, the human story became louder, clearer, more personal. But something sacred was lost, too. The mysticism of the old scripts, the hieroglyphs' breath, the cuneiform's weight, gave way to simplicity. The world traded beauty for clarity, mystery for mastery. Writing became faster, sharper, less like prayer and more like power. Yet even in its plainness, the alphabet carried the same pulse that had begun in the dust of Sumer, the need to preserve, to connect, to remember. The lines had changed, but the desire behind them had not. The alphabet was the bridge from eternity to expression. The moment humanity learned not just to record its gods, but to write itself. When humanity learned to write its voice, it also learned to command. What began as a whisper on clay and papyrus became the language of empires. Words that once prayed, now ordered, punished, and ruled. Writing, for the first time, was no longer just memory. It was authority, made visible. The ancient kings of Mesopotamia understood this well. Their decrees, pressed into stone, could not be questioned. A spoken word could fade or be denied, but a carved one could not. Around 1750 BC, the Code of Hammurabi rose like a pillar of truth and threat in the heart of Babylon. On it, hundreds of laws were etched in black diorite, a monument not of mercy, but of permanence. An eye for an eye, it declared, a tooth for a tooth. Justice had been bound in stone, and stone would not forget. From that moment, power began to flow through ink and chisel. The word could crown a ruler or condemn a thief. It could shape the laws of men, their faiths, and their wars. The world had entered the age of written order. Across deserts and seas, civilizations followed. In the Hebrew hills, prophets and scribes recorded divine revelation on scrolls of leather. Their words, carried from tent to temple, spoke not of kings, but of covenant, of a God who wrote his law upon the hearts of men. The Torah, the Vedas, the Avesta, sacred texts took form in this era, claiming not human authorship, but divine will. For the first time, writing did not just reflect faith, it created it. Believers did not simply hear their gods, they could now read them. And once written, faith could spread beyond tribe and border, enduring long after the voice that spoke it was gone. But writing was not only salvation, it was also a weapon. Empires used it to command armies, collect taxes, and justify conquest. The Egyptians inscribed victory on temple walls. The Assyrians carved terror into the gates of their cities, recording their enemies' defeat in blood-chilling precision. Each word was propaganda made eternal. Yet within this control lay a paradox. The same medium that chained truth also freed it. When a word was written, it escaped the mouth of its master. It could be copied, carried, twisted, or reclaimed. Revolutions, too, began with ink. In the libraries of Nineveh, the last Assyrian king, Ashurbanipal, gathered thousands of clay tablets, histories, epics, medical texts, star charts. He called himself the keeper of the secrets of the scribes. But when his empire burned, the fire baked those tablets instead of destroying them. Centuries later, archaeologists found them preserved, the words still sharp, untouched by time. The king was gone, the conquerors were gone, but the words, they remained. Every empire learned the same lesson. Steel bends, stone crumbles, but the written word endures. As the centuries turned, the alphabet carried law and scripture across continents. It crossed into Greece, where philosophers inscribed the logic of thought. It entered Rome, where emperors sealed decrees with wax and signet. It survived the fall of cities, the rise of faiths, the collapse of time itself. The word, once divine, had become human, and in doing so, more powerful than ever. It could bless or destroy, preserve or deceive, and though the scribes of Sumer could never have imagined it, their quiet marks in clay had become the heartbeat of civilization. For writing had given humanity the one power it shared with the gods, the power to create worlds with words. By the time the last echoes of the ancient empires faded, a quieter revolution had already begun, one not forged in bronze or conquest, but in ink. What clay and chisel once captured in permanence, ink and parchment now carried in grace. Writing, once heavy as stone, became light enough to travel. The Egyptians had pressed reeds into papyrus, but now parchment, made from animal skin, allowed words to endure centuries without crumbling. Monks in the cool shadows of monasteries copied scriptures by candlelight, their quills whispering across the page. Each stroke was prayer, each letter devotion. It was the Middle Ages, and in the dim glow of monasteries perched on cliffs and valleys, the word survived the world's darkness. When war, famine, and plague silenced kingdoms, the scribes wrote on. Their ink preserved not only scripture but science, philosophy, and fragments of forgotten civilizations. In the stone cloisters of Ireland and Italy, hooded monks bent over vast wooden desks. Hours passed unnoticed as they shaped each letter with care. The faint scratching of quills blended with the hum of prayers echoing softly through the halls. A single page could take a week to complete, yet they persisted, for to copy was to keep the light alive. Books became sacred objects, chained to tables, guarded in monasteries, worth more than gold. Knowledge was fragile, and those who carried it treated it as holy flame. But outside those stone walls, the world was changing. Cities grew restless. Trade flourished. Languages evolved. The silent pages of monks would soon find a louder voice, one made not by hand, but by machine. In 15th century Germany, Johannes Gutenberg dreamed of freeing the written word from its prison of scarcity. In his small workshop in Mainz, he forged metal letters that could be rearranged and reused. The printing press was born, and with it, the human mind was unbound. Where a scribe once took years to copy a single Bible, the press could print hundreds in months. The word that once belonged to temples and kings now belonged to the crowd. Knowledge, for the first time in history, became contagious. The world trembled. Ideas once whispered spread like wildfire. Reformations, revolutions, renaissances. Ink became rebellion. The press turned thinkers into prophets and readers into believers. The written word had found its speed. In Italy, Dante and Petrarch gave birth to the vernacular, turning divine poetry into human speech. In Germany, Martin Luther nailed words, not swords, to the doors of faith. In England, Shakespeare shaped the alphabet into emotion. Each letter carried centuries of evolution, each word an echo of clay, stone, and prayer. Writing had become the bloodstream of civilization, carrying knowledge, memory, and imagination from one generation to the next. The libraries of the ancient world had burned, but new ones rose, filled with pages that multiplied faster than fire could consume. And yet, for all its progress, something ancient remained. The act of writing still felt sacred. The smell of ink, the weight of paper, the quiet moment before words took form. It all whispered of those first scribes by the river, their hands trembling over clay. The pen was now their descendant, the printing press their monument. In every letter, pressed onto a page, there was the same yearning, to outlast time, to leave proof of thought, to make the fleeting permanent. Writing no longer just recorded the world, it recreated it. As the Renaissance dawned, light poured through Europe's windows, not sunlight, but the light of knowledge. The age of ink had begun, and the human voice, freed from clay and stone, rose to meet it. The written word had survived empire and fire. Now it would survive ignorance. From the tablets of Uruk to the presses of Mainz, a single thread connected them all, the desire to remember. The world had changed 1,000 times, but humanity's oldest instinct had not. To write, to speak, to remain. The age of ink was not just an evolution of technology, it was the flowering of consciousness. Every page turned was another dawn. Every printed word another spark against the endless dark. And as the presses thundered through the night, filling the air with the scent of oil and paper, one truth became clear. Writing was no longer a tool of survival. It was the soul's declaration of existence. Thousands of years after the first marks were pressed into clay, humanity writes again, this time with light. Fingers glide across glass instead of reeds over papyrus. Words no longer dry in the sun, they flicker across screens, vanishing and reappearing in the endless scroll of the digital age. Yet beneath the technology, nothing has truly changed. The same desire that moved a Sumerian scribe to carve into wet earth still moves the modern mind to type, text, and post. The medium has evolved, but the message is the same, to be remembered. In ancient times, a single tablet could outlive a kingdom. Today, billions of words are born every second, tweets, emails, messages, stories. The world is drowning in language. What was once rare and sacred has become infinite and fleeting. We write more than ever, but remember less. Still, somewhere within this endless flood, the same quiet miracle remains. Every word, whether pressed into clay or tapped on a screen, carries a heartbeat, a small defiance against time. The digital world has become a new kind of library, vast, invisible, borderless. Its shelves stretch beyond sky and sea. A photograph, a sentence, a name typed once into the void, all linger in circuits, waiting to be found. It is the same dream the scribes of Uruk once chased, that thought might survive its maker. But unlike the clay tablet, the digital word is fragile. It can vanish in an instant, deleted, overwritten, lost in silence. And so the paradox continues. Writing gives us immortality, but only for as long as someone reads. The ancients understood this. They built temples of stone to protect their inscriptions. We build servers instead, towers of humming light that hold the memory of the modern world. Within their endless codes sleep our stories, our fears, our truths, a civilization written not in dust, but in data, If the power fails, if the light dies, the silence will return. Yet even that silence would not be empty. Beneath it would echo all that has ever been written, as it always has. For writing is more than marks or screens. It is the continuation of consciousness, the bridge between memory and matter. Think of it. The first line drawn in mud by a trembling hand led here, to words that travel faster than thought, to stories carried through invisible air. The human impulse to leave a trace has never ended. It has only changed shape. Somewhere, a student types a message to a friend. Somewhere else, a poet writes a final line before dawn. Somewhere far above, a satellite records it all. A billion fragments of language orbiting the earth. The clay tablets have become constellations of light. And perhaps one day, when our own civilization fades, when our cities crumble like Uruk and Thebes, some distant mind will uncover what we left behind. Not stone, not papyrus, but patterns of energy, traces of our words preserved in the faint hum of the cosmos. They will read us as we read the ancients. They will know that we too once tried to remember. From the dust of Sumer to the glow of a screen, writing has been the same sacred act, the attempt to make thought eternal. Every word, every letter, every symbol is a flicker of that same fire, still burning in the dark. We write because we fear the silence. We write because we hope to be found. And as long as the words endure, even in fragments, humanity endures with them. The story began in clay. It continues in light. And somewhere, across the span of millennia, the first scribe's trembling hand still moves, pressing meaning into the dust, one mark at a time.